I have the privilege of working in two great universities, at Oxford and at Stanford. So I start in a university, often in a library, reading everything I can find on the subject I want to write about, talking to wonderful colleagues who, in the case, starting with my own college, St. Anthony's at Oxford, who know about almost every corner of the world. So by the time I go to Tehran or Tiraspol, which, as you all know, is the capital of Transnistria, I already have a sheaf of notes, a bundle of photocopies, and a list of contacts and introductions. When I get there, I always try and give at least one lecture as a visiting professor. These can be curious occasions. In the case of Iran, it was a seminar attended by Jane Fonda, whose hijab was, for mysterious reasons, a European Union headscarf. Quite surreal sight. The main speech was an endless speech in Farsi without translation, of which I understood approximately one word in 100, but that word recurred with great frequency, and that word was Chomsky. Chomsky, so that one understood nothing and at the same time everything. In Serbia, the host, my academic host, appeared 2 minutes before the lecture began and said, I'm terribly sorry, I can't chair this lecture. They're bringing guns from the forests. The insurrection has begun. And disappeared. I felt I should try and using this excuse in Oxford one day. The most moving was talking in Burma, where Aung San Suu Kyi invited me to talk at the headquarters of the National League for Democracy. Some 300 people packed into a tiny house. Every one of them had risked arrest to come there. My talk was interpreted by Aung San Suu Kyi into Burmese. I talked about transitions to democracy, and they simply wouldn't let me go. I was there for 3.5 hours, question after question. How do you make a transition from dictatorship to democracy? You say we should do a truth commission. How do you do that? Can we put them on trial too? Can we put them in prison too? It was one of the most moving experiences of my life. And it is, I think, very interesting in such occasions, particularly to talk to students who, in many of the kinds of situations I'm interested in civil resistance or opposition movements, are often very, very important, the vanguard. For the rest of the time, often for weeks, I travel around looking at everything I can see, talking to everyone I can meet, from the president to people in the pub. In effect, I work as a reporter. And that is considered occasionally slightly infra-dig in British journalism. In my book, it is a badge of honor that I would wear with pride. In my view, one of the glories of American journalism is that supremely well-educated senior journalists continue to work as reporters in the field and are proud to describe themselves as such, people like John Burns. Whereas in Britain, every 21-year-old just out of Oxbridge wants to be a columnist and to give us their views on everything before they really know about anything. I think we need more of the American school of hard, serious reporting in this country. There is a marginal advantage of being there as a visiting academic and traveling as a reporter, which is you tend to have some slightly less restrictions, at least some of the time. For example, in Iran, you don't have an official minder from the Ministry for Islamic Guidance. You can travel more freely. Then back to Oxford or Stanford with the notebooks, the photographs, the tapes, all the materials, a period of intense reflection emotion recollected in tranquility, discussing again, debating with colleagues, the fact-checking about which I'm quite fanatical. In fact, the only person I know who is more fanatical about fact-checking than me is in this room. That's Adam Roberts, who is, dare I say, the grand Ayatollah of fact-checking, if not the supreme leader of fact-checking, as I know, because we're working on editing a volume together. And then the invaluable process of editing, for example, working with a great editor like Bob Silvers of the New York Review of Books, asking constant questions, what do you mean here, haven't you missed out that, which hugely improves the resulting project. So that, in very brief outline, is just a sense of the process in the workshop, the fairly elaborate and long process that goes into making each handmade chocolate in this box. Now, I'm always very amused when I read the prefaces to volumes of collected essays or collected journalism, at the ways in which authors, clearly spurred on by their publishers, try to suggest a deep coherence to the whole of this work, an underlying theme that runs through it all, the fallacy of false coherence. I'm not going to fall into that trap. It is what it is. It's a collection. A box of chocolates is not a treatise on the nature of the praline. But before throwing it open to this conversation, of course, I'm happy to talk about almost anything, and certainly everything that is in the book. I wanted to say a few words in telegraphic brevity about two themes which are there in the book, one really in the title and one in the subtitle. The theme in the title is about facts and how we get at them, and how perhaps the conditions for finding facts about the world beyond our shores are changing rather rapidly in our time. And the second theme is about the decade that this book covers. So first of all, facts. Facts are subversive. As many of you know, I.F. Stone, the great subversive American journalist. I've used that quotation often. I thought when I took it for the title of the book that I should perhaps just double check where he'd said it. So, of course, I Googled it, and I found an impeccable source. Unfortunately, the source was me. It was an article I had written where I'd attributed it to I.F. Stone. I thought that's not quite good enough. So with the help of Felicity Brown, who I think is here, I contacted the editor of an anthology of I.F. Stone's work, his two biographers, his daughter, and his son, who has a massive website of his works. None of them could find it. It is still just possible that I.F. Stone did say it, but for the time being, it's me. But I do deeply believe that facts are subversive, and perhaps we could talk about that in discussion. And just to give you a sense, I believe facts are subversive of the claims made by democratically elected leaders as well as by dictators, by biographers and autobiographers, by spies and heroes, by torturers and postmodernists. To give you a sense of what we're up against, let me give you just one famous example. What is now known as the Downing Street Memorandum, the secret but then published record, that leaked record of a top-level meeting with Prime Minister Tony Blair at 10 Downing Street on the 23rd of July 2002, the key meeting in the run-up, or a key meeting, in the run-up to the Iraq War, where the head of MI6, known only as C, summarized his recent talks in Washington thus, I quote, Bush wanted to remove Saddam through military action justified by the conjunction of terrorism and WMD. But the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. The facts were being fixed. And in a way, you can tell many of the stories of our time, and not only of our time, as the struggle between fact finders and fact fixers. And of course, fact fixing has taken many different forms in history, and there have been many worse times for the facts. I would say the 1930s were definitely a worse time for the facts, when Orwell was writing. If you were living in Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia, it was a hell of a lot more difficult to get at the facts, notably about your own country, than it is even for someone living in Burma, or let alone China or Iran today, as we've just seen. The form of fact-fixing, which I think is characteristic of our time, is somewhere at the frontier between media and politics. It's what in Britain we call spin, what in Russia they call political technology. Now, I'm not going to go into the entirely valid philosophical question, you'll be glad to hear, what is a fact? And I would absolutely acknowledge that there is a rhetoric of fact, particularly in English, in which you say, the fact is, followed by a statement which is not by any stretch of the imagination a factual proposition. The fact is, the man's a shit. It may be true, it's a very English statement, but it's not a factual proposition. The fact is, Blair never wanted to take us deeper into the EU. Not a factual proposition, right? The fact is, Blair will be president of the European Union. Not a factual proposition. Facts are not to be confused also with larger statements about truths. Facts are like cobblestones. You put them together to make roads which can lead in a number of different directions, though not in all possible directions. They are like mosaic pieces which you put together to make pictures. And all journalists, all historians, all lawyers indeed know that you can make many different pictures from the same mosaic stones. The roads can lead in many different directions. But nonetheless, I think the first job of the historian and the journalist, not the most interesting, not the most important perhaps, but the first job, is to find those facts, to establish them, and then go on to look at context, interpretation with imaginative sympathy with all concerned, to ask the questions about causes and consequences. Now, the interesting question is whether fact-finding about faraway places is becoming more or less difficult in our time, in the way our media are changing. And put very simply, this is a discussion under the auspices of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I think there are two schools, put very simply. What I'd call the techno-optimists and the scripto-pessimists. The techno-optimists, like Jeff Jarvis, to name one name, the famous professor of blogging, say these new technologies, new media, open up extraordinary new horizons. We will all know more about everything, and we will know it better. And there's nothing the old media couldn't do that new media can do better, can't do better. The scripto-pessimists say, well, that's all very well, but in the meantime, the foreign news bureau of great newspapers are closing down at a rate of knots, closing like they're being turned off like the lights being turned off on a janitor's night round. In the meantime, we are getting less and less serious, verified foreign news in our newspapers, on our mainstream television news. This has a lot to do with the economics of publishing, of course, and actually we're getting less serious reporting and analysis of the world outside at a time when, because of globalization, because things that happen over there affect us very directly here, we should be getting more. Now, very roughly, and again in telegraphic brevity, I think that the techno-optimists that there's a lot of truth in what the techno-optimists say, but that the scripto-pessimists have yet to be proved wrong, and actually that our job is to prove them wrong. First, the techno-optimism. It is absolutely amazing, if you look at the coverage of Iran, what we have been able to find out, visually, in audio, in every which way, of what happened in extraordinary detail from what happened in Iran, even when a strong authoritarian regime is clamping down on foreign journalists and confining them often to their hotel rooms or offices. My first job of foreign reporting was done from Albania under Enver Hoxha in 1978. I went in on a progressive tour, which was the only way you could get in. My company was 7 Marxist-Leninist teachers from Leeds, a Scottish engineer, and a former imperial policeman called Mr. Godsave, who told me over a late-night glass of Lumumba, which was a local drink named after Patrice Lumumba, that he was there to get to know the enemy. I had a notebook and a Kodak Instamatic camera, which wasn't much use because you weren't allowed to photograph anything anyway. There was no way of checking, of getting visual evidence out, of getting audio evidence out. None of those resources were available. Compare and contrast what we have now. And by the way, this is true of most of what we laughably call recorded history. Because of course, most of history went straight down the bath hole. It was never recorded. Imagine if we had had the digital cameras and the mobile phones and the MP3s and all those devices we have in Paris in July 1789. Imagine how much more we would know about the French Revolution. Imagine if we'd had them at the execution of Charles I. He nothing commended or mean upon that memorable scene. Or did he? Perhaps he did. Perhaps if someone had had their little mobile camera, they would have captured the common and mean moment before his head was cut off. In other words, I think there are absolutely extraordinary new opportunities for capturing the history of the present and capturing it for posterity. And one shouldn't underrate that. The problem comes in discriminating between fact and what Norman Mailer wonderfully called factoid, which the mass of material on the web really does not help you to do, sometimes to the contrary, I think, or at least we have to develop the techniques to do that, in the contextualization, in the analysis, in telling the story in a single coherent way, in the way that the great essayists of foreign reporting used to do, like, for example, Neil Acheson in his great reportage in The Observer. And this, as I say, has a lot to do with the economics of news gathering, and particularly of newspapers, which of course are in profound crisis. The great Guardian editor C.P. Scott famously said, "Comment is free, but facts are sacred." Today, in the news business, that is varied to, "Comment is free, but facts are expensive." Facts are expensive. And I would say, and this is for discussion, that a very large proportion of the verified quality original content that you find in all that mass, in all that ocean of material on the web, actually comes from perhaps a dozen leading magazines and newspapers and news organizations, most of them, by the way, in the Anglo-American world. Take away the New York Times, the Financial Times, The Economist, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, Harper's, the Atlantic Monthly, the Guardian, the BBC, Prospect, and a few others. What would you have left in terms of quality original content, which is endlessly circulated about on that mill? That's, I think, the problem that we face at the moment, and it's a problem we have to address. That is to say, I think the scripto-pessimists have to be proved wrong. And the question before us is how they are proved wrong. How do you find the new ways of using these extraordinary opportunities for capturing the history of the present, so that the facts are checked and verified, they are put in context, there is analysis with the depths of a good historical essay. There are interesting attempts to do that, which we could perhaps talk about. Global Post on the web is one. Open Democracy, the web magazine, which interestingly heavily draws on the work of academic and other specialists, is another. But that's the challenge before us, to seize the opportunities, but to keep the old news values in a new form. Finally, and very briefly, a comment about the decade which is covered in this book, which is called Political Writing from a Decade Without a Name. I've actually written a book, or published a book of essays from each of the last 3 decades, the 1980s, 90s, and this decade without a name, because I refuse to undignify it with the label the noughties, which I think is abhorrent. It's like putting a frilly frock on a sweating bull. Decades are arbitrary divisions of time. Sometimes history chimes with them. Normally it does not. The 1980s, it chimed with the decade. That is to say, 1989, the unforgettable year of wonders 1989, was an extraordinary culmination to the decade. I would say this hasn't been true of the last 2 decades. I would say that as we talk about the long 19th century and the short 21st century, so we should talk about the long 1990s, which really go from the 9th of November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which John mentioned, to the 11th of September 2001, from 9/11 written European style to 9/11 written American style. And then this very short decade, which I would argue is already over. Because, I mean, one of the things I have in the book is an account of an extraordinary, not to say surreal, conversation with George W. Bush in May 2001, before his first official trip to Europe. And the interesting thing was that in 2.5 hours of conversation, it may have felt like 2.5 years, it was 2.5 hours, he never once mentioned Islamic terrorists, not once. The world we were talking about in May 2001 was quite different. But I would argue that that decade actually ended, to be precise, on the 4th of November 2008. That it actually only lasted 7 years and barely 2 months. Not just because of the significance of the election of Obama, but also because it came in the context, and I think partly as a result of, the biggest financial crisis for 70 years, the first truly global economic crisis, which also revealed and catalyzed major geopolitical shifts that had been, as it were, nascent before, notably the rise of China and other non-European powers, non-Western powers. So that I think this decade was in many ways shaped and defined still by the United States, particularly by the Bush administration, by what it did, for good or ill, mainly for ill, but also by what it failed to do. I would venture a guess that the next decade, the 2010s, will not be shaped to the same degree by the United States, indeed by the West as a whole. In other words, I think that this is perhaps the last decade in which the United States and the West as a whole was clearly setting the agenda of world politics. And I would venture a guess that in the next decade, the 2010s, that may no longer be the case, but of course I may well be wrong. A last quick word about Europe, and then I'll sit down. I write, of course, always consciously as an English European. I think for Europe, this decade has been a mixed bag. Some great developments, the great enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe in 2004, the success of the euro thus far, but also the endless boredom of the institutional debate, the failure of Europe to get its act together in foreign policy, to which I'm afraid Britain in particular, although not alone, has contributed. I really do feel, looking back at this decade, that one of the key failures was the failure of the Blair government to overcome that endless, tortured British ambivalence about our relationship to Europe. I quote in one of my essays something that the historian Peter Clarke wrote in his History of Britain in the 20th Century, published in 1996. He writes, "The difficult issues of British politics revolved increasingly around our relationship with the European Union. Issues," I quote, "which could hardly remain unresolved into the 21st century." Well, here we are, quite a little way into the 21st century, and they're as unresolved as ever, and what is more, I fear that in our likely next government, we will go further back into that tortured ambivalence about our relationship with Europe. I find this a sort of Groundhog Day prospect, at once deeply depressing and deeply boring. If one did not feel impelled from sort of British and European patriotism to fight the good fight, one would want to emigrate or hibernate for at least 5 years, because you know perfectly well what's going to happen. At the end of those 5 years, they'll have got a bloody nose, they'll have discovered you can't realize your purposes, your purely national purposes, without working through Europe, and they'll be back reluctantly in a position of European realism. But in those 5 years, a lot of time will have been wasted. I hope on that, too, I'll be proved wrong, but in any case, that's my guess. That's for the next collection, that's for the next decade, the 2010s, the volume that I will hope, if still alive, if not having both feet in the grave, to produce somewhere around 2019 or 2020, and hindsight can indeed wait until it is 2020. Thank you.